We're very glad to welcome you to the second day of the symposium. We will start in a bit with our fourth session. My name is Johannes STÜCKELBERGER. I am the chair of this session and will also give a presentation myself. So I have a double role here. Co-chair was originally Paul Post, who sadly has fallen sick, so he will be replaced by Kerstin Gute. I would like to start with a brief introduction. If we contemplate a church reuse, we can have different approaches. In this session with the title, The Perspective of Process Planning, we would like to focus on the how of this process. The success of a project depends largely on this question of how. A few examples from Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. This is what we want to use as a basis to discuss what we need to focus on during a church reuse project and how to proceed during such a project. Normally, we speak of project planning in this context, or project management. We are suggesting to instead speak of process planning, and we will discuss what this term means and what it can look like specifically. And this is what the three presentations this morning will deal with. The first lecture will speak of a single church or parish. The second lecture focuses on a bigger region, the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and the third presentation is about an entire country, the Netherlands. I will shortly present our three speakers today. I myself, Johannes STÜCKELBERGER, I'm an art historian and a lecturer for religion and church aesthetics at the Theological Faculty of the University Bern, and I'm a titular professor for newer art history at the University of Basel. 2015, I founded the Swiss Church Building Day, and I dedicated the first two conferences to the subject of church reuse. This resulted in a website with, among others, a database of reused churches in Switzerland. JÖRG BESTE, our second speaker, studied evangelical theology, Dutch philology, as well as architecture and urbanism. In 2003, he founded the office Synergon, Urban Development, Social Space, Culture in Cologne, which focuses on a new use of church buildings. You will see what this focus means in his lecture, in his presentation. Our third speaker is Frank STROLENBERG, who is a specialist for organizational planning and communication, and has been working since 2010 at the Rijksdienstvoorzitter Cultureel Erfgoed, that is a cultural heritage agency of the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science in the Netherlands. He is the leader of the program Future Religious Heritage. And you will get to know what this mission, what this role means based on his presentation. Okay, so now I will start not in my role as chair, but in my role as speaker with the first lecture, which is entitled Repurposing Church Buildings as a Process. My lecture is based on the question how we can have good solutions for church reuse. My theory is that church reuses are successful if we see them as a process. I will tell you what that means in three steps. First, I will ask what a process is. Second, what planning and implementation of a church reuse as a process contains. And third, why church reuse should be planned as a process and implemented as a process. As an introduction, I will tell you about three examples which seem to me to be suitable to start this topic. They are three examples from Switzerland. First example, the Reformed Church St. Leonhard in St. Gallen in Switzerland. This church had services until 1995. Then it was used as a city church because there was a need for repairs. And this was supposed to cost 4.5 million francs, which is why the church council decided to sell the church. There were no interested parties, so an architect sold bought the building for 40,000 francs in 2004. which is basically nothing. The buyer wanted to, or suggested turning it into a cultural center. But the attic burned down in 2007, which delayed all that. And then in 2013, the reuse plans were not accepted by the Monument Preservation Agency. And since then, nothing has been done. The church has not been used since for 17 years, even though it is in a prime location in the close to this train station. Second example, the Reformed Matthew Church in Bern. In 2014, the parishes in the city of Bern were called upon to propose how to reduce their real estate costs by 50%. The Matthew parish proposed to demolish its church. They planned to celebrate the Mass or the services in the Catholic church, which was nearby, so to merge with the sister congregation. This plan did not work out because the Catholic parish sold its church to an Orthodox congregation. A demolition of the church was not possible because it was considered to be listed or worth preserving in an inventory of monuments, which was then not published at this point. So they planned to sell the church and negotiated with a private entrepreneur. And then the neighborhood association held a petition, and a big majority of the inhabitants of the neighborhood signed this petition. This petition demanded that the church and the neighboring community center or parish hall should remain public space. Then the parish negotiated with the city of Bern, which was successful because the city decided to acquire the leasehold rights to this ensemble. They wanted to introduce a day school and a nursery, and half of the church was supposed to become a public library. The other half was supposed to be available for Mass. Third example, the Catholic Church St. Joseph in Lucerne. In 2004, this church from the 1940s and the neighboring parish hall or parsonage was found to have a need for repair. They used the opportunity to rethink the future use. There were strategical guidelines of the Catholic Church of the city of Lucerne, which demanded a stronger orientation on the needs of the neighborhood and a collaboration with other neighborhood associations and the town. So there was a clear utilization concept, which was then also implemented. The parsonage, including the forecourt, is today serves as a meeting center and conference venue with a cafeteria and offices. The big church space is now an église modulable, so a flexible a church which can be modulated, which can be flexibly used. So you can see that in the picture above. The big liturgical festivities of the church parish still take place there, but the space is also rented or leased for exhibitions, concerts, rehearsals, banquets, conferences, even neighborhood festivities, and even for the Friday prayer of the Muslim congregation. The parish hall or room in the is rented out as a public nursery, but the weekday chapel is still a place of tranquility and contemplation. And the parsonage is used by the Association of Church Streetwork. It is still owned by the parish, which still does do its work as a church in this neighborhood, but the church parish is now also entrepreneur in the sense that it is doing work for the neighborhood. So we have the two focuses of pastoral care and neighborhood work in a dynamic unit or unity. So there are 1,600 cases of rent or activities per year in the center. So it is also a financial success. So in these three examples, the challenge of church reuse was approached in different ways. They differ regarding the goal, the process, and the result. In St. Gallen, the primary goal was financial relief. So they chose a rapid or quick sale, but this was not successful. The church is vacant. In Bern, the goal was also financial relief. They took a few different paths. They wanted to demolish it, then sell it until the town became the partner. The result is good. The church remains and continues to be a public space. In Lucerne, the goal was to turn it into a neighborhood center, and the basis for that was a clear pastoral concept, which defined the future role of the church and the type of involvement of the neighborhood. They opened themselves in towards the neighborhood. They invited the neighborhood to extended uses, and they looked for partners who could be trusted. And the result was very good. In the first example, they only tried to sell it, but in the other two examples, the trajectory was a process, and the solution, in one case slower, in the other case quicker, was found.
So what is a process? It may be the best idea to clarify what is a process. It comes from the Latin procedere, which means to go forward. So a process means something to move forward and means something which happens over some time, and something develops or maybe becomes something new over a certain time, or something is done over a certain time. If you do not want to emphasize the process but the result, then you speak about progress. Progress or regress if you move backwards. We know this from the natural sciences, but also from social sciences in the 19th century. This is a classical perception of ways, and this is no longer something static, but something dynamic. In process theology, the God concept is now a creative event. The metaphysical principle of being is replaced by a process of the being and becoming of all things. Even in business administration, you make the differentiation between project planning and process planning. In a project, you want to have concrete steps and you want to reach a defined outcome. But a process planning means that you plan certain premises, certain conditions so that something may develop out of that. Project planning is always aimed at a specific outcome, but in a process planning, the result is not clear from the beginning. The next question is, what does it contain and what is included in this process planning? As a child, I liked model railways, and I learned that you can only use it when all the wheels of the train are on the rails. If the wheels are not completely on the rails, then at the first set of points, it will derail because it wasn't put on properly. So the beginning is what counts. You have to do it right at the beginning. You have to put your train on the rails correctly. You have to put it on the rails to re-rail this wagon. Otherwise, it will not succeed. So you have to watch how you set the whole thing up. What does it mean? In a project or a process about a church reuse, you have to answer several questions at the beginning, and some may only be answered during the process, not at the beginning. So I have a set of questions with numbers, but that doesn't mean that this is a very linear process. I'd rather suggest this picture. It's a circle, and the questions come from the periphery, from the outside, and the answers go to the inside. So they meet each other, and each answer is linked to other questions, to other answers, and this way a network develops over time. I was inspired by this picture in our new room of silence close to Zurich. And the artist who developed this was inspired by a map, old sea maps that were meant to aid facilitating with navigation. So let's come to the 8 questions. Question number 1. What is the goal you want to achieve with the reuse of the church? Is it mainly a financial issue? Or is it that you want to use the space in a better way? Or maybe it's something else. Second question. Which object should be reused? Is it the church? Is it the church hall? Is it the parsonage? So you have a list of all the buildings that are in the possession of a parish, and this portfolio lists the various buildings and whether they are listed and who owns these buildings, for example. Once you have an overview of all these buildings, you're open for various options and may come to a different result, that you maybe reuse a different church or maybe a different building. It may actually be the parsonage that should be reused. Third question, how far do you want to go? How much do you want to change? How much are you allowed to change? Maybe it's protected, the building. Can you demolish it? Do you want to demolish it completely? Do you want to build something new? What can you change? How much can you change? Or maybe you can leave it empty for a while. Fourth question, what is the scope of this reuse? Is it meant to be a total reuse? Or maybe just expand the existing use, put something together? Fifth question, who are the partners in this process? What are the church institutions? Are there maybe any civil society, associations, actors, private actors? Sixth question, what kind of use do you want? Do you want a church use, a social use, a cultural use, commercial, or maybe even a private use? Seventh question, who owns the buildings? Should the parish remain the owner? Do they sell it, maybe rent, lease it, or maybe hand it over to somebody else? Eighth question, is this new use appropriate? Does it go together with basic church values? Does the new use respect human rights, especially the right to exercise your religion? Which values are promoted with this new use? These 8 questions have to be included in a new reuse project. And the moment you answer one question, of course, this impacts the answers to the other 7 questions. So you have to keep open for a while because you need to give space to this development. And you need various instruments to answer these 8 questions. You have feasibility studies, maybe you need counseling, consulting services, but also communication is very important. Everybody involved have to be involved or at least informed about the process. A church is a public building, so the actors are not just the parish, the congregation themselves, and maybe also the authorities, but also the whole commune, the whole city. If the public is included in the process, then you get some momentum, you gain movement, you can move forward in your process. And once the 8 questions are answered, then you can start with a reuse. You can maybe start rebuilding, you can conclude contracts and move forward. Let's come back to this layout of these interconnected lines in the circle. You may have noticed that there are 4 points at the periphery that the lines also go outward. And in this room, you can see these continued lines via the walls until the ceiling. Or the other way around, some of the lines from the floor have their origin outside of this circle, in the 3rd dimension, maybe even outside of the room. Maybe they've come through this hole in the roof. So going back to our topic of process, I interpret this as an invitation to be inspired from the outside and be inspired from above. Our last question, why church use as a process? For many of you, this isn't new. In the example I showed you first in St. Gallen, they didn't use these 8 questions, and this is why the result was not really satisfactory. The Bern example meant that you could have saved a lot of resources if you had followed this process with more openness at the beginning. There's another reason why I recommend this process approach, because I want a church who doesn't just look back to the past, but is courageous to move forward, look into the future, which is dynamic and turns toward the future. Of course, there are challenges that we are presented with, and they even be enormous, these challenges, but I would like to encourage everybody to see this also as an opportunity. The opportunity to open up as a church, to find new partners. The example of Luzern showed us that they took up this chance and accepted this opportunity to open up and to give the church a new profile. One last thought. Church use as a process, well, we are invited to do this by the buildings themselves. Churches are places without any specific purpose. It's an open space, open for many things, where things can happen, and you should keep this potential. So this helps this is helped if you see the reuse as a process that takes people to the open, where things are made possible. In this process, church can further develop and meet these processes, meet these ideas. Thank you. Now I'll give the floor to JÖRG BESTE. Thank you very much, Johannes. Good morning. All right, so I would like to talk about process facilitation in church reuses based on, well, it's actually 2 parts. First of all, we have experiences with public initiatives in Nordrhein-Westphalia. And secondly, some experiences from the processes themselves. I'm going to do this in these 4 points, and I'll try to do this in 15 minutes. So the situation of the churches in North Rhine-Westphalia is as follows. It's basically, we have fewer and fewer members of the 4 Catholic dioceses. And this means that many congregations have to merge with others, and we have many, many church buildings. This in turn leads to a high number of demolitions of reuses. And some of them receive quite a lot of public attention, for example, in Essen, because they stopped the financing of nearly 100 of church closures at the time. So there was maybe 1/3 of their churches they wanted to close. And these phenomena first showed in the bigger cities and agglomerations, but now they're also happening in the smaller towns and in rural areas. And this kind of development has consequences for the congregations, for the neighborhoods, for the social development of the city, and also for the building culture. North Rhine-Westphalia has about 18 million inhabitants, 396 towns or cities, and it's a very urban space. So we have also a very high number of churches from all epochs, from all periods. Ursula Klieffer-Schulz has already demonstrated that yesterday evening. We have an extremely high number of and quality of modern church buildings built after the Second World War. And this is also shown in a high number of buildings that, about 40%, that were built after 1945.
I have the careful hypothesis, or the not very courageous hypothesis that of the, or the conservative hypothesis that of the 6,000 church buildings, over the midterm, at least 25%, so 1,500 churches will lose their sacral use, or at least partially, and will have to find a reuse. This estimation is based on the stock taking of church closures. In this model project, together with two larger cities in Nordrhein-Westphalia, Gelsenkirchen and Bochum, we have accumulated inventories of church closures, or registers of church closures. We are sadly the only ones who have done this basic evaluation. And I would like to compliment the Netherlands, where you have a much more structural approach. In Bochum, at least 27% have now been closed, or are expected to close, and in Gelsenkirchen it's 29%. This has clear consequences for the neighborhoods, of course, and for society in general, for the urban society. I think you can imagine that. In this context, it is important to see this process from the perspective of the community. When searching for church reuse, this is always started in the congregation, in the parish, because they own most of the buildings. During the collaboration with now 250 churches, we can summarize a worst case scenario, which can be often found in some of its points. A membership decline with around 25% is very clear and is increasing. Often there has already been a difficult fusion with another congregation, or it is upcoming. The buildings are too big, too many, too expensive. There is a renovation backlog. The building structure was analyzed, but there were no concepts which resulted from them. There is a thinking in districts versus the entire community. The priests or pastors are expected to retire soon and therefore do not want to deal with these problems. The voluntary members of the committees there are not enough of them. There's not enough time and energy for these considerable planning processes. The pastoral concept is at least 10 years old and would have to be reworked. And the question of location is dominated by the emotions of the members of the congregation. The questions are who will take care of this, who knows his stuff, who has the time, and who is neutral. The reactions in the congregations, we can see that many church responsibles or many church committee members fight for their district. The simple real estate is sold first, parsonages, parish halls, unused surfaces. Therefore, the biggest problems remain on the smallest surfaces and have no potential for development anymore. When dealing with the questions of real estate and funding, conceptual questions about community work are ignored or are forgotten. There we have three possible tendencies in this reaction of the community: resignation and withdrawal from the neighborhood, foreign use without a new strategy for the community, or a restart of the work of the congregation. Dealing with the question of the building is also in a place of overlapping interests of church, the public, and the agencies of construction regulation, etc., which all have different languages and do not have many opportunities to communicate with each other. I will talk about this more during the phase of process planning. Now about the public measures. In these overlapping interests, in 2006, the building ministry in North Rhine-Westphalia already did 2 feasibility studies in 2007 and 2010, as well as research and evaluation afterwards. And in 2010, we have a documentary which is still available as a PDF. During this evaluation of these projects, we saw that these transformation processes of the church locations and with their annexes have for the urban development in their environment, because the offers that are lost, we have worked with adults, with adolescents, cultural offers. In the context with these register of churches, you can imagine what this means for the communities. In this situation, we wanted to support the stakeholders in the congregations. So these results were summarized by Tim Rienitz, who will also speak in tonight's discussion. And they were picked up on in the state initiative Stadtbaukultur, so urban building culture, if you will, and this comprised a background, recommendations, a proposed procedure, and 16 example projects or exemplary projects. This is also available as a PDF. Consequently, this topic of supporting the processes on site was further evolved. We published information offers and recommendations for church administrations, parishes, communities, and church administrations with different project components. We also developed an information platform, an expertise network, on-site consultation, and supporting these projects. For example, the need for support in congregations and parishes showed that possible uses, possible partners, the way to find the decisions, as well as funding and questions about locations, had the highest priority for these communities. Then this state initiative, which is now called Baukultur in Nordrhein-Westphalia, they developed a general concept with these project components. Architects and chambers of engineers are supporting this initiative, as well as representatives of parishes and dioceses, which constituted a steering committee. Now, this exhibition is something we saw yesterday. Then we have the information offer on the website and specific consultation offers on site, as well as further training opportunities for those responsible. This exhibition of A Curse and a Blessing, Church Buildings in Transformation, which was presented yesterday by Ursula Klefisch-Jobst. This started at the end of the year 2019 in Cologne. The information offer on the website, Future Churches and Spaces, Zukunft Kirchenräume, was inaugurated with an event in 2019 in Bochum. This comprised 3 interconnected information offers, which are mapped out with portfolios of the individual projects, a network of partners, as well as different topics. For example, procedure recommendations for the reorientation of church buildings as an adaptable set of project components. Here you can see this website and the procedure recommendations. For the information or consultation offer on site, we had a call for ideas of church congregations in 2019. And we chose 8 projects for this initiative in 2020, and they developed first ideas for uses. In the second phase is the implementation, where we chose a few projects. Further experiences are supposed to then influence how we continue, and this will also, of course, be available on our website. Here, the call for ideas for this project, and the 8 church buildings which were then chosen. And finally, a few experiences from this process support or monitoring. Let's go back to this diagram. The main challenge has been seen to be this tension, the overlapping of interests of many disciplines and interests. So many specific stakeholders from the areas of the church, the civic society, as well as planning and construction regulations and agencies. This is a problem, of course. So these voluntary people who may be responsible, of course, cannot handle all of these overlapping interests. So we need moderation. We need moderators for that. Then there, of course, is the pre-use, which was which had a sacral aspect at the consecration, as well as the symbolism of the buildings. So there is a strong emotional connection in the congregation, but also in the neighborhood. Especially concerning post-war buildings, we need also to consider the architectural and structural and urban quality. We have the high diversity of church buildings in their forms, in their layouts, building types, materials, locations, etc. So sustainable uses, feasible uses are not easy to find for these big open spaces. This field, which I showed you, with many stakeholders and very different interests, leads to difficult and very long trajectories to find a decision. So process management is the way we decide or the way we see if this can be done successfully or not. And construction law and planning regulations are often more hinder the process more than they help. Therefore, there are no standard solutions. Each building and its environment has to be considered individually. Every reorientation process has to be planned individually. Important aspects are the situation of the parish with its status quo, but also its potential for development. The situation, the building situation, the structural situation in the neighborhood, as well as the planning process, the stakeholders and the approach, as well as the reuse concepts with their acceptance and their future for the parish have to be considered here. So we should preserve as many churches as possible. Then the second priority would be a partial sacral, continued sacral or church use, and then suitable reuses, which should be deemed suitable from the standpoint of the church, from the society, as well as the architecture. And this should also be important for a subsequent use of the surface if the church has to be demolished, because of course concerning the urban planning aspect, churches are an important factor. So we should reconcile these 3 criteria, and this is not easy to realize, to implement. And finally, a plea to see church buildings not as a burden, but as an opportunity. If we give up these churches, we miss these opportunities. What we've seen from these processes on site is that the upcoming and the existing degree of the situation is a challenge for the entire society. The ecclesiastical life on site is changing considerably. So we need to ask ourselves whether we have a withdrawal or if we have a continued societal relevance. The church buildings will remain, but how many and which ones and with which use? The concepts and ideas do not only depend on the buildings, but also of the involvement of the stakeholders on site or locally. And the church buildings should be seen as an opportunity for the church parishes, for the municipality, as well as for the neighborhood and for the architecture, to avoid these drastic examples of a bad reuse.
Thank you very much. Now, Frank Strolenberg, please, with his contribution.
Good morning, everybody. I'll talk in English. I can understand the German because I lived close to the border in Aachen. But to speak it in German in a professional way is quite hard, so I prefer to do it in English. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this conference. As this sheet shows, I work for the Cultural Heritage Agency in the Netherlands. It's an agency that's on a state level, directly linked to the Ministry of Culture. For more than 10 years now, I've been working on the future of religious buildings. And one thing became clear to me, that this challenge of the future of the religious buildings is not a topic of only heritage, but it's a topic of society as a whole. As JÖRG called it in nicely German, gesamtgesellschaftliche Aufgabe. Wonderful, wonderful word. So you don't have to look at a discussion from a heritage point of view. You have to address this issue on all government levels, we think. You have to work closely with the churches, with heritage organizations and with civil representatives, because it's also a matter of local support. And that is exactly what we try to do in the Netherlands and where I would like to talk to you about. On the next sheet, you see some numbers, because before I zoom in on the Netherlands, I'd like to ask your attention for these figures, these numbers, because we published this book, 88 Inspiring Examples of New Use. My colleague Albert Reinstra talked about it yesterday. And for this book, we compared the Netherlands with our neighboring countries. And there we found quite some interesting facts and figures. We worked closely for this with the European Network of Historic Places of Worship, the Future Religious Heritage Group. We got these numbers. We don't know exactly if they are correct, but these are the numbers we could find. So we hope for the best, and we're still working, and Future Religious Heritage is still working on those numbers. As you can see here, that we have in the Netherlands, we're in the middle on top. We have not so many inhabitants if you compare them to other countries like Germany or the UK, but we have quite a number of churches. So the density of the churches, if you compare them to the inhabitants, is quite large, it's 2.4. If you come to the next sheet, it sees that the secularization in the Netherlands is quite fierce if you compare it to the neighboring countries. There we are #1. There are more people in the Netherlands now who no longer consider themselves as being religious than there are religious people. So as a consequence, if you think of the churches we have, the number of churches and the few people that still visit our churches, then you know what the consequence will be. And that's on the next sheet. We have in total 7,110 houses of prayer. These numbers include all churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples. And about a quarter of them are already out of use. In the next years, up to 2030, it's just been counted by an agency, 1,700 more will be expected to close down. So another quarter of the total number of houses of prayer will shut down. That is why we also published this book, which is on the left, the cover is on the left. It says Kirchengebouwen 88 inspirerende voorbeelden, 88 inspiring examples. And they are categorized from A to Z, from apartment to, in Dutch, zorg, which means healthcare. Because these examples show what possibilities there are in transformation of a church, as Jörg called it, the church as a chance. But we also talk about the discussions around those church buildings. For example, in the next sheet, there are two examples of new use where a church is transformed into a supermarket or a food market. To the left, there's a much appreciated example of a local food market which opened 2 years ago in Sas van Gent in Zeeland. They sell local products there and give jobs to people who have, who have difficulty finding a job. The food market also brought back a real butcher, which had left the village years ago. The food market also respects the outlines of the church and is not very intrusive there. The example on the right is a supermarket in Helmond. It's a standard formula of a supermarket that you can find throughout Holland. It's a formula crammed into the church building with the holy water bowls hanging near the fire hose. Less appealing, maybe, less fitting for sure. But the church building was saved, much to the satisfaction of the local community who fought to save the building. So who is to say what is right and what is proper? On the next sheet, you see an example of two bookstores in churches. They are well-known examples in the Netherlands, both beautifully designed with respect for the essence of the church. But in the book of the 88 examples, we also talk about the financial aspect, also mentioned already by JÖRG, the financial aspect of reuse of churches. Both bookstores can only survive if they bring in more volume to stack their books. So they had to bring in extra floors. Also, they have to offer much more than just books. They organize all kinds of activities and are part of the urban cultural fabric. And on the next sheet, you can see that even though they sell books, they also have to sell coffee and lunches because they need all of this cultural events, these selling books and being a coffee shop as well, to survive. And even though the bookstore on the left, the Dominicaner bookstore in Maastricht, has 750,000 visitors a year, and sometimes even 1 million visitors a year, that was pre-corona, of course. And the bookstore Warners on the right has 650,000 visitors a year, and still it's a struggle to survive. In the Netherlands, no other bookstore has that many visitors. And for that matter, no other church has that many visitors as well. On the next sheet, we see two different ways of creating a private home in a church. New use that shows that reuse of churches can also be appealing for architects, but also interesting for investors, because the house on the right in Utrecht sold for more than €1 million. But in the meantime, on sheet 9, you see that we still have a lot of discussions in the Netherlands. Discussions we don't want to have. Elderly people on the top right who squatted their church because they didn't agree with the board of the parish. Somebody talking into the microphone. There are investors down to the left who tell us that they think investing in church buildings is too risky. And if in any way possible, these are discussions we have to prevent. But these discussions also, again, show that it's a gesamtgemeinschaftliche Aufgabe. That this challenges consider us all, the church, the believers, the government, the people in the village, the investors. The future of church buildings is a civil issue, not just an issue for the church or the heritage sector. And that is why we in the Netherlands, on the next sheet, you can see we created a program where all government levels work together, shoulder to shoulder with the churches, heritage organizations, and civil representatives. Our key instrument is what we call a kerkenvisie, a strategic plan for all of the churches in the community. So not just for the repurposing of churches, but for all the churches, also the churches in just religious use. And I have a small animated film of 2 minutes to illustrate what we mean by this kerkenvisie, which is also an instrument they use in Belgium, by the way.
Nederland telt meer dan 6000 kerkgebouwen. Ze zijn bepalend voor straatbeeld en landschap. Vaak vormen deze kerkgebouwen het middelpunt van de gemeenschap. Menig Nederlander is er gedoopt, getrouwd of heeft er gerouwd. Maar anders dan vroeger worden kerken op veel plekken niet meer zo druk bezocht. Dat betekent minder geld voor onderhoud of voor de energierekening. Daarom moeten we nu nadenken over de toekomst van kerkgebouwen. Ook al is die toekomst niet altijd duidelijk. Kerkgebouwen hebben vaak veel verschillende belanghebbenden, elk met eigen regels, wetten en eisen. En dat kan leiden tot moeizame discussies. Helemaal als oplossingen van kerk tot kerk gezocht moeten worden. Willen we deze markante gebouwen behouden, dan is het dus belangrijk om naar elkaar te luisteren, elkaar de ruimte te geven en de kerken in samenhang te bespreken. Zo komen we tot een integrale kerkenvisie voor alle kerken in een gemeente. En kunnen we samen kerkgebouwen behouden en een toekomst geven. Als kerk, als multifunctioneel gebouw of met een andere bestemming. Meer weten over kerkenvisies? Ga naar www.toekomstreligieus-erfgoed.nl.
Okay. Well, this video, this little animation was recorded over a year ago, and we were still counting our churches, and it says we have more than 6,000. Well, in the meantime, we know we have 7,110. So if we go to the next sheet, please, we see the 5 principles that are the basis for this approach. Principle 1, you have to consider all churches, and not only the historic churches, and not only the churches that are becoming vacant, because the church organizations have all kinds of buildings, and their problems are not restrained only to the historic ones or to the ones that are out of use. So help the churches think about all of their buildings, and we can help one another. Principle 2, involve all the stakeholders. If you leave one out, you're for sure, if you think of it as a process, at some point in the process, they will knock on your door, the ones you forgot. So instead of repairing that afterwards, and all these emotions involved, involve them in advance. Principle 3, don't think that a higher government level can fix all of your problems, because that's what 10 years ago was the idea in the Netherlands. Just give us a big amount of money and we fix all the problems. That doesn't work. Solutions have to be found within the local community. Principle 4, it is important to think strategically ahead and not just call a meeting when problems arise, then you're too late. And principle 5, don't think that one solution can be copy-pasted onto another situation. Every situation asks for a tailor-made approach. Here are some results of a strategic plan that were created in Rotterdam, for example. The next sheet shows it. In Rotterdam, they have 160 houses of prayer. So together with all the churches, they thought about the future of all those 160 houses of prayer. As you can see, they made agreements on all kinds of practical tools to work on. We created a one-stop shop loket. I don't know the word in English. One-stop shop at the city council for questions. They experimenting with making 10 churches more sustainable. And these are not only the historic churches. But the most important thing of it all is that they learn to talk and listen to one another. It was just mentioned that we have to learn to talk and speak the same language. They have each other's mobile telephone numbers so they can call each other before problems arise. That's very important. On the next sheet shows that we invested as a program to create these strategic plans. We have money from the national government, 9.3 million euro, to help all of the local communities to create those kerkenvisies, those strategic plans. Those 9.3 million euro is quite an amount of money, and it wasn't overnight that it was created. It's 10 years of work to create this trust with each other and to create a joint lobby to create this amount of money. But also we put a lot of effort in exchanging experiences and the knowledge. And we created a platform of confidence as well. If you measure the output in the next sheet, and I'm almost to the closing now. If you measure the output, you can see that many parties are involved. and that new parties stand up and want to be involved. On the next sheet, please. Even big investors are suddenly interested, because if you can make plans like in Rotterdam for 160 churches, that could be an interesting financial proposition. One church is a problem. 160 churches are an opportunity. My final statement on sheet 15. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important to look at the output, but it is even more important to look at the outcome of such a program. Because the preservation of churches, whether in religious use or with new uses, is important to society as a whole, on the local level, on a regional level, on a national level, and even, as I mentioned before, on a European level. That is why I think it is not only important to compare each other's best practices, but to work together on a European strategic agenda. Europe is becoming a geopolitical force, but also a continent which likes to stress its own identity. I think that our churches embody who we are and what we stand for. So whether we think of economic profiling, sustainable energy transition, or social cohesion, churches can play an important role in this, on a local level, on a regional level, on a national level, and on a European level. So thank you very much, on the last sheet, for your attention. If you want to know more about the program, the strategic instrument of Kirchenvisie, or our book with 88 examples, please inform at our website. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for these 2-3 contributions. I would like to start by discussing some questions with the speakers, but so we have 25 minutes left for the discussion. Then I would like to open the discussion, and Kerstin Gothe will then introduce some questions from the chat. My first question is directed towards the audience. Maybe you can answer in the chat. Frank, you showed a very relevant slide with numbers, how many churches there are in Sweden and in Holland, in Germany, etc. And you calculated how many inhabitants then are served by a church. So we have in the UK much more churches, so 1,400 inhabitants per church. So I would like to ask the audience, but not orally, please answer in the chat. Are there numbers for your countries? Frank didn't find these numbers for all the countries. I know that they don't exist everywhere, but it would be interesting, I think, to know that about other countries. So if you know the numbers for your country, please write them in the chat. And the another question, are there databases which are publicly accessible where these numbers can be found? For Switzerland, we have a database which we developed for modern churches, which were built since 1950. We have 2,000 churches there. So you can say that this has been, this number is reliable. Another first question to Frank, a topic that Frank also addressed, but the question now I address to you, Jörg. Frank said that together we can preserve these church buildings and give them a sustainable future. What does sustainable mean? This is a question which of course concerns monument preservation agencies, but also the churches. And churches have to deal with this question. Which conditions have to be fulfilled in order to call the reuse of a church sustainable? Question for you, Jörg. Well, unfortunately, many conditions have to be fulfilled. Primarily, sustainable means a long-term period of time. And you showed this example of selling a church dirt cheap to an architect. I would say that is not sustainable. So these buildings are sustainable, in my perspective, when they fulfill a role, a function in the social cohesion. So if it is a building that does continue to fulfill needs of people in its neighborhood, but mainly it is not a commercial use in that case. And churches with their annexes, but also as meeting centers, places of encounter through connection, attachment to the church, they have this function of enabling meetings and encounters. If they can continue to have that, and if we as a community are successful in funding that, then I think it is sustainable. If we have a gym which continues to be active during the corona pandemic, then it is not sustainable. So with the discussion in the chat about the Schlecker market, which I showed, the fact that it does not exist anymore as well, it shows how unsustainable some uses can be. It doesn't matter where it is, and it doesn't matter what is there now in this church, but it clearly shows, I think, how unsustainable some of these reuses, which we can see now, are if you see the 10-year perspective. I would like to ask a second question, Frank, which is addressed to you. You coined the phrase, "It's all about dialogue." So a reuse becomes sustainable if you approach it in a dialogue, if you involve as many stakeholders and partners as possible, which then also fight for the preservation of this church and feel responsible for it. What are your experiences with these partners? So basically the church, the state, the society, monument preservation authorities, urban planning agencies, the public. Which languages do they speak? And what are your experiences as someone who has supported these processes of collaboration, who has moderated these collaborations? What are your experiences with these different partners?
I'll talk to you in English again.
Yes, of course. Of course.
If you look at the strategic plans that are already made or are in progress now, you can see that the subject at first has to be discussed behind closed doors. That's what people want, because the churches don't want to have all of the information on the street, because if you want to make a discussion about the future of the buildings, you also have to present your uncertainties. And if you present them in public and say, well, maybe this church is going to close down, then all hell breaks loose. So there has to be some private discussion before you can go public. That means that the local government and the churches first have contact on their and discussions on the future of the buildings, and they still have troubles connecting to the general public. But in the end, they have to connect to the general public because, as I said, the local community has to support this, the future of the building. So you have to make a connection. But it's still very uncertain and not very common how to use this, how to do this. So they're in quite a more of an experimental way of talking to the general public. But it's happening more and more. And we have within our working group, within our program, we also have representatives of the local civilians, all kinds of heritage groups, and they are informed how to talk to the, bring in the elements into these discussions. So it's happening, but it's very slowly. It's more Until now, it's more a professional discussion, and you have to take care that it becomes a public discussion.
A discussion behind closed doors at first. I will pick up on a question from the audience here. Who initiates this process in this small circle? And who then, in this small circle, takes over the moderation? Who moderates this discussion? And who guides the further process or process planning? But at first, okay, so this question to you, Jörg, you have experience with these process plannings or process monitorings. What is your experience? How do you approach this? When I am asked to support these processes, these local processes, it comes from the churches themselves, who have seen that they need support and consultation. What I would wish for is that our church institutions develop helpful instruments to support their local parishes. In some regional churches and dioceses, there are tools, but I think there are not enough. It is a great problem, a great challenge, and the effects on the local parishes for the local congregations are catastrophical if these processes are not supported and are not monitored. It can lead to a further membership decline, a further backlog, tensions in the community when these processes are not being monitored in a careful way. And so these higher ups in the church administrations, I see them as responsible to moderate this transformational process. But it is at least as difficult and as complex and long-term as the processes themselves locally are seen. So in the Netherlands, we have experiences, and here we have experiences with the public. We maybe would have to organize an internal conference, how to rework these experiences, how to learn from them, and how to maybe support these processes on a higher up level.
Okay, let's have some questions from the chat. Kerstin, do you have collected some questions from the chat? Yes, the question of the process, that's something which is actually the red thread of the chat. So what is the role of the architect in this? What is the role of the facilitator or the moderator? Maybe this question goes back to everybody. Mr. BESTE has already started on this aspect with this dialogue. So how far do you need neutral facilitators who can take over such a process? What kind of qualification should this person have? And Mr. Hermelink asks, who should have that hat on? Should this be an external person, or who should that be? And also the question, how long does such a process take? What is your experience regarding that? Maybe as a first question. And I would like then come to a second round of questions. Okay, I'm not just a chair, I'm also a presenter, so maybe I would like to start with an answer to the question of the architects and who should wear the hat. You may have remarked in my presentation that the architects were mentioned right at the end. And I said, once you have answered all of these 8 questions, you can maybe start to build or to involve architects and conclude contracts, etc. I still believe that this is true, but that doesn't mean that in the whole process, architects may already be involved and may conclude feasibility studies, because it doesn't make any sense to plan in a certain direction, which the building can't really sustain, which isn't possible in this building. So the architects, of course, should be involved during the whole process, because they have an eye for that, for a building, for what a building can do and what you can do with a building. But a specific building construction plan, that is something that comes right at the beginning, at the end. From my perspective, let me answer the question of who wears the hat, who is in charge. In my experience, many congregations, first of all, are very much on their own until they come to a point where they realize, well, they need some consulting, they need advice, and they need partners. So my advice would be to start quite early on to have some kind of commission or committee where the parish is involved, but also authorities are represented, of course, monument protection representatives, civil society representatives, where everybody is involved. They should start quite at the start so that this is something that everybody is concerned with. So I completely agree with Frank Strolenberg. This should be something which should take place in a protected space where the media are not already present right from the start. But maybe the two of you, Frank and Jörg, maybe you have other answers to that. Well, the question of the hat, who's in charge? I don't know. I would rather talk about responsibility. You know, if you are a moderator, you are not responsible. Well, of course, there is somebody in charge of the discussion in order to facilitate the discussion, but the owner of the building carries the responsibility for the building, and they have to make sure that they value this responsibility and respect the other interests if they want to have a successful outcome. Of course, you can discuss very long if those who own the buildings actually are the ones who own it in an ideal sense, or maybe if it's rather something which is owned by the public because over centuries the public has been using these buildings, but that is rather a philosophical question. At the moment, we have the legal owners and they carry the responsibility. Regarding the architects, I'm an architect myself. Architects are planners, and planners can plan buildings or they can processes, but they shouldn't see this as an acquisition for a project afterwards. If I go into such a process, I always say at the beginning, I'm not here to design anything, and I don't want to acquire any kind of job out of this, but I am a facilitator in this process. And afterwards, we have to have some kind of procedure. This can be an official bidding process in order to try various things, and then the best idea has to win. But if we have architects that are in this process in order to see it as an acquisition of jobs, of orders, then of course this is a great mistake right from the start. Frank, would you like to comment?
The thing with the responsibility, I also worked on transformations of all kinds of buildings. So not only on churches, but also on office buildings, factories, or former factories and everything. What we found there is that the owner is very often not capable of thinking out of the box, because they think within their problem that they know, they are the problem owner, and it's very hard for a problem owner to think out of the box and find a solution. So you need moderation from outside quite often. An architect can be one of those moderators, but as Jörg said, he doesn't have to be the builder. But the architect has creativity within them, and it can be used. In the Netherlands, we talk a lot also about research by design, where you can find all kinds of visualizations of the problem or visualizations of opportunities. But don't start with building sketches, because that is not the issue here. It's about helping a progress, helping a process in the making. So the creativity of an architect can be very helpful. But it also can be other parties. In the Netherlands, if you think about the strategic church plans, we have a lot of private bureaus who specialize in, well, sometimes even mediation and organizing processes, organizing public discussions and stuff like that.
Yes, I would like to comment on that. What I'm learning in the framework of this session is something that, of course, there are various structures in the countries. In Switzerland, for example, we have a very federal structure. So each congregation, each parish does their own thing, and they are very much on their own. In North Rhine-Westphalia, you have very much the initiative that goes from the federal state, and they may then support others. And in the Netherlands, it's the whole country. And there is a national authority that is responsible for this process. So it differs. Of course, this impacts the framework and the roles and responsibilities of the various people who are involved. So you have to see what the situation is in each country or in each location. But maybe we have other questions? Yes, many people have mentioned the whole situation of churches in rural spaces, which is of course quite true. And this is why we have another session for that tomorrow. So I would maybe exclude these questions now because we're going to deal with them tomorrow in the discussion on rural spaces. Robert Plum asked, well, first of all, he thanks Johannes that you talk about the reuse and that you mentioned the human rights in this regard. And he asks, how do you justify that? What's the basis for that? And I'm still collecting the other questions. I think we don't have that much time left, but well, yes, the question is always what's appropriate as a reuse? What is appropriate for a former church? Appropriate also in the sense that, well, the symbolic value of a church, or rather the church is there in the public and is still being perceived as a church, no matter what happens to that building. It still has a tower, it has this typical form of a church. So in that sense, it makes sense. And I think it is appropriate to find an appropriate use, which is in line with the former importance of this structure and with the symbolic value of this building. And a corresponding use means that it has a link to that what church stands for traditionally and also today, that there is some kind of connection. And it was already said yesterday, we have cultural reuses, social reuses, religious uses. So the core values, the core tasks of church should be preferred. That's how I would justify that. Maybe let me include one last question. It's a question to JÖRG BESTE, but probably to everybody. I would like to quote.
Within the Catholic Church, awareness of what's happening and the necessary related training of the religious authorities is an issue, at least in France. Question of who can be involved in the process planning on the religious side.
Yes, I talked about responsibility before. So it's a responsibility of those who own the buildings. That's usually the churches or the parish. And then there's a responsibility of those who organize these parishes. That's usually the diocese. And in that regard, there's still some potential to do more in these processes to really support people in that. It usually works well when this responsibility comes from the grassroots and is also accepted by the grassroots. And then you ask for support. The next question is then how much this is accompanied on a theological level, on a church level, that's something else. Maybe that's a higher instance, a higher level. And so far I've seen only a few helpful initiatives. I keep hearing things that we are the people of the people. We're not a church of stones. We have to deal with the people, not we don't have to care about the stones. And what theologians usually forget is that the people have a lot of emotions connected with these stones, that they want these stones, and you may lose these people if you lose the stones. So it's the common points what they have in common, these people in those places, and take care of that in the sense that, Johannes, you just mentioned, to continue in a way that promotes the community, even if you can't do anything you want, and to open it up. This is a responsibility which is seen by many as positive. If you do the opposite of that, you support this perception of churches are doing bad things and don't care for the people, and I don't want and wish this to anybody, this perception. Okay, maybe you would like to add anything to this question, or anything you have learned from this session, anything you would like to note?
There's still a big question of the churches themselves. Whether it's a discussion of we're not erected to do this discussion on the buildings or not, but I think they're very much in need for help. I hope that the bishop can give this help, or that the higher authorities in the Protestant church can give them, and they are really trying. Some of them really try, but there's a lack of not urgency, I think, but a lack of knowledge of how to address this issue, and everybody's struggling with this. So from the government point of view, or from the heritage point of view, I think we can help them, but it needs them to be open for help, and that's a big thing. But it needs to be worked on, and we're working on it for 3 years now already, or even longer, and they're opening up. And on a local level, it's already happening very, very often. But in a higher hierarchy, it's quite a challenge. But I think still the end quote, you asked me for an end quote, I think it's wonderful work on churches, because they're very special. And the heart is in it from almost everybody. So I think this is the common ground we can work on, this emotion, this passion for the buildings and what they stand for.
Yes, thank you very much. So my alarm clock has rung. We are finished with this session. I would like to close with the statement that there will be many questions unanswered from the chat. There was one question: what is construction law, for example? Well, construction law, you can Google this question, and the differences of lease and rent. And there was questions about the inventory. That's also very important, especially in Catholic churches. This has to be taken into account. What do you do with the furniture, with the inventory? I think we don't have a session on that, but I would like to encourage you, look to the chat who asked this question, and then interact with that question. Maybe have lunch together and discuss the questions that interest you in the chat. Do it between and amongst you. So once more, the tip: you can download the chat, you can save the chat, and then you can contact the people that interest you. Thank you to the presenters, and thank you to you for attending, for listening. Thank you for your active participation in the chat.